Is sugar toxic to your brain? Is eating fat going to increase your risk of developing brain diseases? Is eating animal proteins or just generally eating meat a really bad idea for brain health? In this episode, we're going to be exploring some of the most common myths and misconceptions around the science for brain health, specifically around nutritional neuroscience. How do our foods translate into our brain state? If you're interested at all in deconstructing some of the popular themes we're seeing right now on social media that are very easily made into sensationalized posts but don't relate to the science, if you're interested in understanding what the science actually tells us about fat and sugar and animal products and brain health, you're going to love this episode. I'm Dr. Austin Perlmutter, and I have been focused on finding practical strategies and tools for educating people on how to enhance and preserve their brain health. That is the purpose of this channel. And in this conversation, we're going to be focusing specifically on some of these nutritional myths and deconstructing where they come from and the real science behind some of these recommendations. As a quick disclaimer before we get started, this is not medical advice. This is purely for education. And if you like this content, please subscribe to this channel. Please follow along. It helps me to create better and more content that reaches more people. So with this said, let's get into this topic, specifically around fat and animal products and sugar and brain health. For background context, the question as to whether our diet influences our brain health shouldn't really be a question. Even though some people operate under this assumption that diet doesn't have a lot to do with what happens in our brains, the reality is that, like every other part of our bodies, our brains are built out of core biology, which means they are made out of cells, and those cells are constructed from the nutrients that we consume through our diet. To give you some context as to how many cells we actually have in our brains, somewhere in the neighborhood of 160 billion, of which half are neurons, half are what are called glial cells, and all of these cells have to be given energy in order to function. That is why our brains, despite being only 2 to 3% of our body weight, use up around 20 to 25% of our body's energy. And very importantly, that energy has to come from our food. So both in terms of the physical building blocks of our brain cells and in terms of the energy necessary for our brain cells to function, absolutely our brains are influenced by the quality and the quantity of what we consume through our diet. Now, with this said, that does not necessarily mean that every single dietary intervention is going to make a big difference in terms of brain health. And like everything else, and one of the themes you'll see come up here time and time again, we have seen that nutrition has been sensationalized on social media, more generally in terms of diets that are recommended. Everything is about the diet that is going to fix all of our problems, where the reality is that most people will jump on a diet and quit it within a few months, and therefore it doesn't have that much long-term impact on their brain function, save the psychological pain that occurs because a person wasn't able to stick to a diet. And a very important consideration here, and this will always be the way that this is kind of portrayed in terms of the literature that I have seen, it is not about a specific food. It is not about eating a specific meal. It is about the quality of the food that we eat in aggregate over many years that has the biggest role to play in how our brains function. Now, with all that said, as I said at the beginning of this conversation, we're going to be focusing on a couple of the key conversations around certain nutrients and foods as it relates to brain health and where there have been some myths and misconceptions. To give a little bit of the lay of the land in terms of the conditions that most people are interested in, both from a research perspective and from a general conversational perspective that link these foods, these nutrients, to brain health outcomes, we see it's things like dementia, risk for dementia. The most common form of dementia, about 70% of cases or more, is Alzheimer's disease. We also have age-related cognitive decline. We have mental health conditions, of which I would say depression has the most research specific to diet quality and risk for depression and potentially reversal of depression symptoms, some for anxiety, some for stress, some for general symptoms like brain fog, which is a little bit more poorly defined, some for things like attention and focus and cognitive ability in a given day. But it is true that each of these things relates to the food that we eat. at the very least through the pathway of neurometabolism. All of these conditions have been correlated with neurometabolic state and neuroimmune state, the immune system of our brains, and both neurometabolism and immunity are influenced by the food that we eat. It doesn't mean, however, that eating a blueberry is going to have a dramatic effect on those systems and therefore relieve your depression or basically prevent Alzheimer's. But at a lower level, these things are all true and they all have a function. So in addition to immunity and metabolic state, it's also relevant that our diet influences the brain by way of the endocrine system, neurotransmitters, neuroplasticity, the functional connectivity, basically how our brain's areas speak to each other. And all of these things are relevant to, again, the topics we're discussing today. So let's get right into the first of these three themes. This one relates to fat and brain health. Like anything in the realm of diet, it is much easier for many people to compress a complicated and nuanced conversation into a soundbite. So it would be easy to say, don't eat fat because fat is bad for your brain. And we've heard this from some groups, some organizations. One of the questions might be, why? And kind of the background here is to understand that many decades ago, there was research that was released that indicated that, in particular, saturated fat was concerning for cardiovascular disease. Now, that led to a number of changes to recommendations in the United States and around the world, including things like the food pyramid, which you may recall from the 90s, kind of a recommendation, a blanket recommendation that we should avoid fat. And I think explicitly it said in this food pyramid that fats and oils should be used sparingly. The idea here was saturated fat was perceived to be bad for us, that it would increase risk of cardiovascular disease, which was then and still is the top cause of death around the world. Also in this bucket, more recent understanding was things like trans fats. Trans fats, I think everyone agrees, are something we should avoid, especially when it relates to things like inflammation, which, as we've kind of discussed, is a reflection of the immune system. Inflammation in the brain, bad thing, relates to risk for depression, dementia, and other brain-related maladies. So part of this does make a lot of sense in terms of we should avoid specific fats. But one thing that we very quickly gloss over is that all fats are not the same, both in terms of whether they are hydrogenated, meaning do they have double bonds or not, and in terms of the length of the fat. Based on these variables, fats can be used by our bodies differently. So as it relates to different types of fats, I guess the main thing to understand is fats can be either saturated or unsaturated. And in terms of unsaturated fat, you can have polyunsaturated fatty acids. Important in this group are the omega-3 fatty acids, DHA and EPA. And then you can have your monounsaturated fatty acids. And these are things that are found in a number of vegetable-based products. Avocados are a popular example of where monounsaturated fats can be found, as well as olive oils. Generally speaking, the research indicates that polyunsaturated fats, specifically these omega-3 fats, when consumed from dietary sources with some variable research around supplementation, are good for the brain. Now, again, like everything else, there is nuance. And you might be asking a whole bunch of questions as to what is the quality, and you should ask this question, what is the quality of those polyunsaturated fats? If you get a fish oil product that has been sitting on the store shelf for 8 years, that polyunsaturated fat may not be good at all because it's oxidized, it's rancid. So it doesn't mean that just because it is a polyunsaturated fat that it is good for your brain. But generally speaking, the research would indicate that consuming a diet rich in omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids, EPA, DHA, is a good vote for brain health because those are fats that are disproportionately found at a high level in our brain structure and have been linked to good brain function. Similarly, monounsaturated fatty acids have been correlated with better overall health and are a component of the Mediterranean pattern diet. And importantly, as we'll discuss in just a moment, one specific food, extra virgin olive oil, is actually related to better brain health, meaning if people consume more extra virgin olive oil, they tend to have better brain health. So this throws off the whole notion because that is a purely basically fat that fat is intrinsically bad for brain health. Let's just say here when we go to some of the saturated fat conversation that there is some variability in terms of the research on saturated fat content and brain health. And importantly, there are multiple forms of saturated fat, some of which may be more concerning for brain health than others. What I would say here, so that we don't go into way too much detail around this, is in terms of triaging, that polyunsaturated fats and monounsaturated fats seem to be consistently a better vote for brain health than saturated fats. Some saturated fats may be more concerning for brain health and may have a negative impact on brain health. So by and large, eating foods that are richer in polyunsaturated and monounsaturated fats, things like, again, maybe a omega-3 rich food, that can be something like a piece of salmon. It can also be things like nuts and seeds that are rich in these basically precursors to these polyunsaturated omega-3 fatty acids, as well as monounsaturated fat-rich foods like olive oil and avocados, good vote for brain health. So the point that I would like to make here is that when we look at fat, I don't think it's helpful to say that fat is bad for the brain, because you're actually writing off certain fats that may be quite beneficial to the brain. And just to kind of drive this point home, one study that was published recently that looked at extra virgin olive oil, they looked at in a randomized controlled trial in people with cognitive impairment, and they found in this small trial, only 25 people, that there were improvements in cognitive function and improvements in blood-brain barrier function in people who consumed the extra virgin olive oil. We also know that when you look more generally at kind of population level epidemiology, people who consume more olive oil tend to have a lower risk of brain-related issues. Specifically, in one study, they found that consuming 7 grams a day or more of olive oil was linked to a 28% lower risk of developing death from dementia. So, relevant point here being, we need some nuance around fat, and certain fats may actually be good for the brain. Okay, so that's talking about fat. Let's move on to what is always a popular topic, which is the idea that sugar is bad for the brain. How should we approach this? It's easy to jump to the conclusion that all sugar is bad for the brain, we should avoid sugar. But if you really want to talk about the science here, we need to define sugar, and we need to define the difference between dietary sugar, meaning sugar that we consume, and sugar in our bloodstream. Because the reality of it is that your brain right now is running primarily on sugar, specifically glucose. There may be some exceptions. If you are in a fasted state, if you are on a ketogenic diet, then a disproportionately higher amount of your brain metabolism will be running off of ketones, ketone bodies. However, for most people, and most of the time, our brains run off of and absolutely need a steady supply of sugar, specifically glucose. Here's the important thing. Eating glucose is not the same thing as the glucose in your bloodstream, even though they do have a correlation. So if you were to consume a meal that was readily digested carbohydrates, so think of like a loaf of white bread, or if you were to eat foods that are sugary, meaning they have added sugar in them, that will increase the average person's blood sugar levels. What does that do for the brain? It turns out you don't want super high blood sugar levels. You definitely don't want super low blood sugar levels, and you don't want your blood sugar levels to go back and forth very rapidly or from a very high to very low level, meaning a big delta in terms of what might be best for the brain. So eating foods with added sugars or foods that readily turn into digestible sugars that increase blood sugar levels is probably not a good idea for brain health. One additional correlate to this is that a certain form of sugar, which is called fructose as opposed to glucose, is not going to spike your blood sugar levels, but may still have a negative impact on brain function because it has a net detrimental effect when it's consumed in higher levels. This is at least what the research suggests, on metabolism, on immunity, and therefore on brain function. So as we look at this topic, sugar and the brain, what I would say is don't be afraid of sugar as a concept. It is actually, from a biochemical perspective, 100% necessary for our physiology and our brains to function well. Don't be afraid of carbohydrates, because carbohydrates can be incredibly good for us, but do consider that many of the foods basically anything with added sugar, and foods that rapidly metabolize into glucose that may acutely lead to high blood sugar spikes and over time damage our metabolic and immune health are things that might be worthy of avoidance. So the more simple the carbohydrate, meaning the more quickly it digests into sugar, the more historically these foods have been refined. So meaning a bowl of frosted sugary flake cereal is not the same thing as eating a piece of vegetable or fruit. So the more a food has been refined, the more that sugar becomes bioavailable. These are things to consider. The third thing we're going to talk about here, maybe the most contentious of these three conversations, is the role of animal-based foods and brain health. Now, there is always this perennial conversation around whether animal products are good or bad for us. And I think it's so important to pull out various opinions around what is ethically right and what is best for the planet. So those are not necessarily things that I'm going to weigh in on here because they're not exactly related to the nutritional value of meat and brain health. Although some might argue if we're looking at planetary health, then long term, this is a lot to do with human brain health. But the question as to whether meat is good or bad for the brain is something that we can dissect. As we think about nutrients that are found in meat that are relevant to brain health, it is true that meat tends to be quite packed with nutrients that are linked to better brain health. Some of the examples would be protein and amino acids. They are bioavailable in meat, and some data suggest that consuming at least a steady amount of protein and bioavailable amino acids over time is a good vote for brain health. Doesn't mean you have to get this from meat at all. However, it is true that getting adequate protein is important, and it's easier to get adequate protein from meat on a, I guess, per ounce level if we're talking about the protein content of most meat relative to the protein content of most plant-based foods. There are other nutrients found in foods that are meat that are more available, for example, vitamin B12 and zinc. Omega-3 fatty acids may be the best example, while plant-based foods do contain the ALA or alpha linolenic acid precursor to EPA and subsequently DHA. We know that for most people, conversion rates are relatively low. So if you want to consume omega-3s from a dietary source, you either have to look at supplementation from an algae-based source if you're a vegan, or you have to be considering things like fatty fish if you are somebody who eats meat-based products. Creatine, a topic that I've discussed at length, is very interesting. From a number of studies, it's been shown that it correlates with better brain health. Creatine is found primarily in meat-based products. There tend to be lower levels in people who are vegan. Choline is a little bit controversial because some research indicates it gets converted into a product called TMAO that may have an inflammatory potential, but we do know that choline consumption may have also benefits to brain function. Some research suggests that higher overall intake of choline is linked to better cognition. Now, those are specific nutrients within meat. That doesn't necessarily mean that meat itself is good for us. Specifically as it relates to brain function. To look at that, the best data we have available is going to be looking at kind of large-scale observational data. And one study that I would draw your attention to was published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition in 2021. It was entitled Meat Consumption and Risk of Incident Dementia. They looked at almost 500,000 people from the UK Biobank, tracked them for about 8 years on average. What they found is two things. One, eating unprocessed red meat was not linked with a higher risk of developing dementia. Instead, it was actually linked to almost a 20% decrease in all-cause dementia and a 30% decrease in developing Alzheimer's dementia. But when we look at processed meat, so we're talking about things like hot dogs, we're talking about those sandwich meats, we're talking about hamburgers and other forms of processed meat, that consuming processed meat at 25 grams a day was correlated with a 44% risk increase in all-cause dementia and a 52% risk increase in Alzheimer's dementia. So again, what we're talking about here is a piece of steak is different from chicken nuggets that have been highly processed, that a hot dog is different from let's say, some bison that has been farmed and some grass somewhere. Now, I know those are some major generalizations, but the point here being that the more a food is processed, in this case, processed meat, the worse the correlations were in terms of risk for, in this case, dementia. Now, if we were to ask, well, okay, that's only observational data. How much interventional data do we have? Not a lot. What we do know here is that there is not much data suggesting that a purely meat diet is good for the brain in terms of something like a carnivore diet from a sustainability perspective. And I don't mean from the planet, but I mean from an individual's perspective in terms of relying on a carnivore diet for brain health. We don't have much data. We also know that plants have a ton of nutrients that are linked to better brain health, and people who eat more plants also tend to do better in terms of better brain health outcomes. So if we are going to consider meat and brain health, I think it is reasonable to say that there's not a lot of data suggesting that eating meat is bad for the brain if the meat we are eating is meat that has been minimally processed. And in the context of the meat conversation, while some will not necessarily agree with my definition, fish, specifically fatty fish, are probably the single best vote in terms of what has been linked to better brain health. If you are somebody who is wondering, should I be eating meat? Well, this is not the conversation about saying you should add meat to your diet, but it is something where if you do choose to eat meat, that what we're learning is the less a food has been processed, the better. And so I think you can look at that from the perspective of, is it a processed meat product? Or you can look at it from the perspective of saying, how much has that meat kind of been messed with in terms of its life cycle? So eating foods that have been raised in the best ways possible when you can afford it, which means grass-fed beef as opposed to grain-fed beef, grass-fed beef as opposed to feedlot beef, means chickens that are pastured as opposed to chickens that are kept in tiny pens. It also means if you can eat wild fish, maybe consider that. And I'm not trying to say that that is an absolute. I certainly don't abide by this 100% of the time, but this is just what both the data would suggest in terms of what may be best and in terms of what makes sense as far as what the data extrapolated suggests for long-term brain health. So let's put all of this back into the general context of where this conversation started today, which is to unpack some of the myths around what is good or bad for brain health, and particularly looking at some of these popular topics around fat and sugar and animal products. To go through one more time, research does not indicate that all fats are bad for the brain, and rather indicates that certain fats are quite good for the brain, specifically polyunsaturated fatty acids, the omega-3s, and monounsaturated fatty acids, things like avocados and olive oil. Saturated fat, there is still a debate, and I don't think there is good research to suggest that we should be prioritizing or eating more saturated fat for brain health. Rather, we should consider trying to eat more of those mono and polyunsaturated fats. Trans fats are definitely bad, so hydrogenated, these vegetable oils, definitely something that we want to be avoiding. The good news there is that we've largely phased those out of most foods in the United States food system. As it relates to sugar, don't be scared of the idea of sugar. You definitely want to consider sugar is not a bad thing, but dietary sugar in the context of added sugar and in the context of foods that rapidly are metabolized into sugar are probably things worthy of at least minimizing. I personally try to avoid most foods with added sugar. And then finally, on the animal part of this diet, what I would say is there are many reasons for people to eat less animal-based products. But from the pure perspective of what is optimal for brain health, what the research seems to indicate so far is that consuming minimally processed animal products are not a liability to brain health and may in some cases actually provide an advantage in terms of nutrient density. And if we're going to be looking at animal products, we should be looking at quality and not just the binary question of, is it an animal product or not? So with all that said, thank you so much for tuning in today. Thank you so much for your interest in learning about brain science. Hopefully some of this will be relevant in terms of what you can do to better understand this work and to think about what you do in a given day. If you've been invested in learning any of this content, and if you made it this far, please consider subscribing to my channel. Check out my newsletter. It's packed with this type of content, and leave a comment. Let me know what you think. And I look forward to speaking with you again very soon.